me just talk a little bit about Peter Kent, who I met very occasionally through my own association with BP, though he was, by the time I joined, he was no longer the chief geologist. Now, Peter Kent began his career in an era of classical field studies and adapted with characteristic intellectual nimbleness to the plate tectonic revolution. And if you look at the early literature on the application of plate tectonic concepts, the understanding of continental margins and patterns of sedimentation on continental margins, there were some academics who were running parallel with Peter Kent, chief geologist of BP, but not many. And for that work, he was deservedly recognized. He led the way in applying that new understanding to the offshore exploration for oil and gas. He was president of this society in the mid-70s, and in other roles, he worked across a lot of what were then very rigid boundaries that existed between the academic world and its commercial application. And he also, and this is the particularly relevant and remarkable thing about Peter Kent, he was extremely effective in reaching out to the then community of policymakers. And he combined this role of being a leader in industry, working happily in the front line of research, and talking to the people in Whitehall and Westminster about this. This evening's lecture is to be delivered by a man who, on the face of it, has worked in the opposite direction. So here's a chap who's an MP, chair of this very important select committee. He's working entirely the other way. That's not strictly true, because Andrew began his professional life as on the front line of the academic world in what was then Portsmouth Polytechnic, developing an XRF and XRD laboratory. But what he has done in the years, in his 20 years in Parliament, is worked enormously effectively to reach out from there towards the rest of us. And Andrew, we're just extremely grateful for everything you've done so far, and very grateful that you're going to come and tell us this evening how we can improve. Andrew's been in Parliament since 1992 as Labour member for Ellesmere Port and Neston, which is quite an achievement, since those of us who come from the east of Cheshire have always thought of the west as the posh part. Now, setting aside any party affiliation, we are grateful to the voters of Ellesmere Port and Neston, and we're delighted to welcome Andrew here this evening to tell us how we can raise our game to the sort of heights worthy of Sir Peter Kent. Andrew.
Mr. President, that was a fine introduction. I'm flattered. The solutions will not necessarily be coming this evening. I'm going to highlight some of the problems and hopefully lead the way to something that I'm very passionate about, and that is strengthening the engagement between science and Parliament and science and society. Picture up there was taken just before Christmas. One of my colleagues, as we were walking through from Portcullis House, said, "What the hell's that over there?" And I said, it's the new Christmas tree that we're having up. He said, "Has Burko gone mad?" And this was one of our attempts, and thanks to the Advanced Manufacturing Centre up in Sheffield, they brought the Trent engine on the front end of it down here, and what a spectacular piece of sculpture it would be if it had been there permanently. But And that's the sort of event, and around that there was a lot of detailed engagement with MPs about this challenging area. Mark Twain attributed to Disraeli the phrase, there are three kinds of lies, lies, damn lies, and statistics. I actually can't find the phrase in any of Disraeli's works, and the earliest known appearance came some years after his death, but you might think it an appropriate comment for a parliamentarian. Many think that Parliament isn't a terribly numerate place, and that successive chancellors demonstrate that with regularity. There is no doubt that people struggle with scale. You recognise Westminster Hall. It is old. Americans think it is very, very old. Now, those of you who've been in Westminster Hall, you would have seen the brass plaques on the floor where members of the royal family have lain in state, and further up the hall, the plaque that says Prince Charles stood here for his trial. And people are fascinated by that. But next time you're doing that, just look at the next step up. Now that's, geologists will recognise, is starting to get old. And that's just one step up from the brass plaque. I think by any standards, that is old. Until you, of course, get to stories like this. 3.4 billion. We've gone from a few hundred to 3.4 billion, all in one room. And this is harder still for people to comprehend. The significant part of the population has difficulty with scale. Nevertheless, it's vital that your legislators get their heads around such issues to help in rational risk decision making, prioritising expenditure, and the important task of informing the public of what's actually going on. You may conclude that you need a more numerate Parliament. You may also hear that Parliament's STEM skills are actually very low. We've only got 10% of the House that have worked in any STEM discipline. You might think that's bad. That is 10% more than our American cousins. When it comes to dealing with risk, we also have to realise that many MPs feel that if they're proved wrong in the eyes of the electorate, they become damaged goods. This is often the case when dealing with risk issues, where the media don't handle probability very well. Moving slightly on from there. Just recently, eyes glazed over in the chamber when Julian Huppert MP, a Cambridge academic, referred to Bayesian statistics. And despite the elegant explanation on the slide, the minister, when replying to the debate, then absolutely ignored the point that Julian was making in his speech. Actually, I think the problem was that this was even this elegant explanation was a bit too hard for the minister. Now, I've lost count of the number of times I've been asked by constituents whether I can guarantee something is going to happen or not happen. Probability is a hard concept to communicate to lay people, but recently the Met Office has started to do this with weather statistics, and here's a snapshot of the 5-day forecast, or 1 day from the 5-day forecast at my home, And you can see up here, we probably can't see, it could be a bit larger, they have precipitation probability, 20%, 20%, 20%, actually 20% all that day. If you looked at today's forecast for Sunday, you'll see some tremendous variation, and using some meaningful symbols as well to go with it. And things like actual temperature and what it feels like. They're trying to find ways, together with the use of the traffic light symbols, to help communicate things more coherently. This happens extremely well in the United States. It actually was mentioned in a lecture I was at this morning, organised by the Council of Mathematical Societies in Parliament. In the US, who, bear in mind, use an awful lot of our data from the Met Office, they have a greater public acceptance of the way they present data than the way than the forecasts here in the UK. And that's, I think, because they handle probability, and they've tried to over about a 10-year period, in a slightly better way than we have historically done. And you'll see, for example, probable courses of hurricanes, for example, in a sort of spaghetti diagram that splays out. And that's actually quite a good way of trying to encourage people to look at probability. The Select Committee, which I have the privilege of chairing, looked at some of these issues last year. My first movement into geology proper in this lecture. We looked in one section of our study in the handling of the swine flu outbreak in 2009. We tried to put ourselves in the position the minister, confronted with the scientific advice about the worst case scenario. Whilst he could not and should not have withheld the advice from the public, he should have perhaps been provided with a better way of interpreting the figures. We suggested that the government should emphasise the range and likelihood of various possibilities to the public, trying to make the concept of most probable scenarios familiar to the public's understanding of risk. Reasonable worst case scenarios are potentially misleading, as people think they describe something that's actually going to happen. Let me turn to volcanoes and a little diversion, first of all, if I may. I took that photograph, and those of you who've been there will recognise it's taken from the wonderful place of Taormina, a sort of that wonderful Greco-Roman theatre with Etna in the background, Mediterranean tucked down there. I decided that communications was a priority the day I took that picture, because I was giving a lecture on low-level radioactive waste at a conference organised by the OECD. So I put the paper and that picture on my website before the local press could start talking about taxpayers funded MP Jolly. I mean, it is a fabulous place, I have to say, but it was a serious conference as well. Just by way of a bit of fun, you can do wonderful things with photographs, so don't go rushing off to see Etna. Back to my theme and on to more serious events. In 2010, the possible threat from a volcanic eruption in Iceland had fallen off the Cabinet Office Register of Risk. The simple reason for that was because nobody noticed it. A repeat of that error should now be avoided as a consequence of a report that we did, the one I referred to earlier, because there is now considerably more transparency, and the system for development and maintaining the register itself is more transparent. I, in fact, bumped into Francis Maud, the Cabinet Office Minister, on Westminster Bridge this morning, and I talked to him about the 2012 register and congratulated him at actually following our advice. There is now a better way of describing things, and because there is a more transparent process being adopted, it means that people like yourselves can make an input into concerns that you may have. And of course, it was interesting that all the things you'd expect to be there were there, except there's nothing there about volcanic ash or volcanoes, and there's nothing there about solar weather. Interestingly, in the new version, it's a little bit hard to see from where you're sitting. I'll try and take you through it because I think this is an important document. The 2012 version gives this explanation. It illustrates how the changes that I've talked about have been incorporated. Under newly assessed risks, the text says, the main difference from the 2010 edition of the National Risk Register are the addition of the following risks: emergencies caused by volcanic eruptions, such as that in Iceland, etc., etc., and then severe space weather. Space weather covers a range of different phenomena, including solar flares, coronal mass ejections, and solar energetic particle events. Severe space weather can cause disruption to a range of technologies and infrastructure, including communication systems, electronic circuits, and power grids. The reasonable worst case, they do still use that, for a severe space weather event is based on the so-called Carrington event in 1859, which saw some of the largest space weather phenomena ever recorded. And it goes on to describe the register's risk matrix. The point about reading that out is that for the first time there is some sensible description of what is meant. And interestingly, of course, it hit the press again just a few days ago, but people might be saying poo-poo to it because no significant damage was done. You'll see. The text goes on to say, figures 1 and 2 summarise the 2011 National Risk Assessments. Chapter 3, it says, provides more detail on each of these risks, including information on what the government and emergency responders are doing to prepare for them. Some of the risks, particularly those risks of terrorist attack, are analysed in more detail in the National Risk Assessment than in figures 1 and 2. Well, that's not surprising because clearly that would reveal classified information. And those categories in bold text on those two figures reflect the various risks that can have a security implication associated with them. But they've down here, whoops, go back, down here they've put, here we have one between 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 2,000 as a risk, and right at the far end, unfortunately, there's nothing in there on this chart greater than 1 in 2. Go on the other side, the relative plausibility of occurring in the next 5 years, you'll see cyber attacks in that block and attacks on the transport system being there as well. So there's actually some quite worrying ones in there for people managing risk. So the good news, there is now a greater degree of transparency, and the purpose of bringing this to your attention is that you now have an opportunity through this process to help identify any gaps and help the Cabinet Office and the chief scientific advisor to understand where the real risks actually are. The first point is obvious. The second reflects the fact that when an event occurs, the Cabinet Office or the lead government department creates a committee under the wonderful acronym of SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, usually chaired by the government CSA or a departmental representative, and they'll need to access the most current and best informed opinion on the emergency with which they are dealing. Now, clearly there is a role for learned societies here in all three phases of dealing with an emergency: the identifying the actual risks, managing emergencies, and post-emergency recovery. And I know there are at least a couple of people in the room who have had some hands-on experience. And it goes without saying that alongside this engagement with government, there needs to be a parallel briefing of MPs to help inform the public and to manage the event. Because there is nothing worse than allowing bad science to be the source of information, especially during an emergency. This is when some of the scare story headlines come up, and again, interesting, I saw some of this morning headlines in some of the tabloids about what swine flu was going to do. I'll turn now to Japan, because that provides some interesting lessons for us, not just about the events from a scientific point of view, but the way UK PLC handled them. Even in dealing with remote events like the Japanese tsunami, we do need to be on the ball, not only because of our responsibility to assist other nations, but because we will inevitably have UK citizens living in the country. And we need to ensure that the public at home are properly informed. You know, who could forget the images that were on our screen night after night demonstrating the power of the sea? In the case of the tsunami, and particularly after the Fukushima event, the UK played an enormously important role in providing both expertise and informing the public, both in terms of UK residents in Tokyo as well, UK residents living in Tokyo as well as folk at home. And the difference of reaction in different European countries couldn't have been more stark. France advised its citizens to go home. Germany turns its back on nuclear power. And the UK... Now, early in the emergency, it was clear that many UK nationals living in Japan were understandably extremely worried about the situation, particularly as it was difficult to get clear information in the country on what was happening. Consequently, Sir John Beddington, the CSA, held several teleconferences with UK nationals in Japan, hosted by the UK Embassy in Tokyo. And Sir John was supported by officials from the Office of Nuclear Regulation, the Health Protection Agency, and the Department of Health. During the teleconferences, Sir John was able to outline SAGE's overall assessment in terms of the reasonable worst case and their view on the actual situation at the plant. UK nationals were able to ask Sir John directly, or the other experts, questions on a specific area that was of concern to them. And although this was a very fast-moving event, the open and rational approach adopted by Sir John appears not only to have resulted in a sensible response from the British living at home, but the British living in Japan. And I think, put simply, the way he described it is the risk of a dose of a radiation, of any radiation exposure was greater flying home than staying put. And this very starkly illustrates, again, a difficulty of scale. Now, the next slide, you'll see the scale is a problem because the screen isn't big enough for it, but we'll work our way through it. And this is this slide, which comes from a source called informationisbeautiful.com. It isn't the exact slide that John used, but he used this source in a lecture he gave recently to the Foundation for Science and Technology. And I'm going to take you in large sections and work our way down the slide. At the top, we have eating a banana, airport security scans, dental x-rays. Per day in Tokyo, 250 kilometers southwest of Fukushima. You know, this is clearly very, very low level. A flight from New York to LA. And on the left, for the more technical, in micro sieverts up there. And then going down the chart a bit further, as you can see, a chest x-ray, spinal x-ray down here, a mammogram, the average CT scan. And we're now into millisieverts down here. Moving further down, smoking is 1.5 packs a day for a year. Maximum yearly dose rate permitted for US radiation workers. You can tell the source of the data. And telling you roughly what's going to happen. At this point, 100 rem, temporary radiation sickness possible there. And it takes you to get down to this level before you start talking about early fatal dose death levels. And so on and so forth. And as you can see, this provides a much more comprehensible picture of radiation risk than referring to becquerels or sieverts. The core message from Japan is surely whatever nature threw at the Fukushima plant, it was the tsunami that killed a figure that certainly exceeds or possibly nears 20,000, but even today cannot properly be calculated. And there are, of course, people in this room who would say that if we could have some of the, we could have improved the sea defences, we would have improved the sea defences had we had the knowledge we have today of the fault structure in offshore in that area. But of course, 40 years ago when the plant was built, that may not have been possible. In this example, Sir John really does illustrate how good communication is vital and how it works, because it is the case that by engaging effectively with a lay population, not only did it influence the behaviour of people in Japan, British people living in Japan, but it has significantly, as I illustrated, made a difference in terms of the way the UK has responded to the nuclear debate in comparison with our European neighbours. I want to now look at shale gas as an interesting area. Here are some reports coming up. You recognise that place, it's gone a bit fuzzy. It's not that the tower is shaking at the time the shutter was taken. There's some stories from the Northwest media that tell an interesting tale about the shale gas finds. Whatever the true amounts, but is yet to be independently verified. Much of this gas may not be feasibly recovered, and environmentalists have been quick to point out the problems associated with the technology used to extract it. Here's another one, 2nd November 2011, fracking blame for Blackpool Quake. So any of you who were working for Quadrilla are being blamed for shaking the tower so it's going to fall down. Of course, it's admitted by the company, fracking tests near Blackpool, likely cause of tremors. The problem in all of this is that nobody put this into perspective. Of course, everyone in this audience will be familiar with the Richter scale. I apologise for the person whose copyright I probably infringed by borrowing that. It is, again, something that is down to not fully understanding logarithmic scale. My colleagues in the Department of Energy and Climate Change Select Committee said environmental problems associated with fracking in the US could be overcome by tight regulation and good industry practice. I think many people in this room would agree with that. The MPs said the government would need to be vigilant to ensure the technology didn't pollute water or produce excessive greenhouse emissions. Environmentalists, on the other hand, said MPs should have called for a moratorium on shale gas. The campaigners wanted a moratorium until research into allegations about the technology is complete. The challenge is to ensure that the opinion of the Select Committee that was an evidence-based study takes precedence over the pressures coming from the environmental lobby that has started off in an anti-position. Now, of course, there are issues that have to be looked at most carefully, but that is not a reason for making the mistake that we've now seen in Germany, where we have significant protests against, for example, carbon capture and storage, on the same sort of grounds that this is going to cause my house to be disturbed and so on. And Germany's upper house quashed a bill last September that would in principle have allowed underground storage of carbon dioxide. In a vote, the 16 states that are represented in the Bundesrat failed to reach a majority in favour of the proposed law on carbon capture and storage technology, or on asking the arbitration committee to bargain some sort of compromise. There is a sort of process where votes are close that they can get a process of conciliation working, but that wasn't done either. The federal government could still technically call the arbitration committee in an effort to eventually pass a law and thus implement a European Union directive for dating back to 2009, or face treaty violations for not implementing the legislation. This is a country that has over 25,000 onshore wind turbines, compared with our total, including offshore, which is just over 3,000. They're also burning huge quantities of lignite. They've announced the withdrawal from nuclear, and we hear of resistance to the strengthening of the infrastructure for their national grid. So it's clear that in Germany there's a huge disconnect between science, policymakers and the public. So the problems we see here are not uniquely British, but they illustrate my point about the better engagement by scientists. And my example of how Sir John dealt with the Fukushima event, I think does show that opinion can be public opinion can be swayed in the right direction if sensible people are engaged in the process earlier on. Where we've had evidence-based inquiries such as the DEC Select Committee, Parliament, broadly speaking, comes to sound solutions. But even that was too late to stop a powerful anti-campaign gathering steam on fracking. So I'm going to come now to some conclusions. The big energy issues related, big energy-related issues will have to be the focus of our attention for some time to come. And more challenges around security of supply and the decarbonisation of industry will hit us on a daily basis. It's a racing certainty that we will see continued objections to the exploitation of natural resources, and yet if we're not careful, the lights will go out. That means decisions that some regard as unpalatable will have to be taken, as there's yet to be an energy source that meets with 100% approval. Every system has its disadvantage. You could say there is no such thing as clean energy. Issues like this and the myriad of other topics which need a strong public buy-in will only be addressed if scientists do even more with both policymakers and the public. A couple of years ago, I was asked by Dr. Tan here, who's a brilliant young woman, did her first degree in Vietnamese, her master's degree in French, and her PhD in English, all in the fields of complex nano particles. She is truly a brilliant young lady. She asked me to speak at a conference about some problems that the nano world was having. And I found this letter written to The Guardian on 1st September 2009. And basically, the gist of the story was there was an accident in a paint factory in Japan. As you know, many surface coatings involve nanoparticles these days. Instead of the writers of the letter saying, this is a good reason for us boycotting buying paint from that factory where health and safety standards are so appallingly low because people died there, it's effectively a call for a freeze on the commercial release of nanomaterials, as I've highlighted. And clearly that kind of problem is one we've seen elsewhere with reactions to other technologies, and also in some very serious issues. The scare that developed around the MMR vaccine, for example, that was picked up, and several parliamentarians, including one or two fairly senior people, ran with that scare story and pushed it very hard and tried to persuade Parliament to legislate against the triple vaccine. These are examples of why, both in the earlier examples I chose from that have a direct impact on the Geological Society, this one, the medical ones, and many others, why we need to build these stronger relationships. Now, we do have some very good mechanisms. We have my good friend Peter Simpson in the audience, who's been for the last 8 years the Secretary of the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. There's an all-party group that's been there since 1939, trying to improve engagement between Parliament and science. We wrote our first report in 1939 on brown bread as part of the effort in the Second World War. we have the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, perhaps sometimes produces papers that are too highbrow for some members of Parliament. We do have access, great access through my select committee to many experts in all sorts of fields. And just recently I rang up Edmund and said the shadow energy spokesman needs to know a little bit more about shale gas. Can the Geological Society find someone who can brief him? These are the kinds of things that are desperately needed at all levels. And I don't, Mr. President, come to you this evening with here's a load of solutions, other than saying to you that you know that what I've said is necessary in a whole range of areas. You might not necessarily agree with my interpretation of the particular examples, but work has to be done to strengthen this relationship. In the United States, although few parliamentarians ever have had a science background, there is a massively strong engagement between the equivalent of learned societies and big trade bodies and the staffers on Capitol Hill. And that's how they avoid falling into some of the traps that are so easily there for us to fall into. But even they have made some interesting mistakes. Other countries too are struggling with this, and the only answer is that we all have a responsibility to find ways of picking up with our individual members of Parliament. How can I help you understand a topic that is facing the country at the present time, or a piece of legislation? Picking up with individual members of Parliament, doing it organisationally through the learned societies, and working hard to ensure that where we have, in the case of the Geological Society, expert geological knowledge, we do help to inform policymakers and the public. So my invitation to you is pick up the challenge.
Well, there are plenty of people here who are going to be in a position to pick up that challenge. As you were going through your excellent presentation, Andrew, I was looking around the room and seeing all the people who are in the front line of the various activities you were going through that have a geological background. And this is, of course, classically a learned society, but only 20% of our fellowship is now academic. 80% is what you could broadly call professional. So there is an edge on our internal debates on these matters, as you well know. And I invite people to contribute to this discussion to keep those internal debates going strongly. Who would like to go first? If you can wait for the microphone to reach you, you thereby achieve immortality.
Andrew, thank you very much. And my name is Rupert Lewis. I'm the Deputy Chief Scientist in BIS, the Department for Business. And first of all, I'd just like to sort of applaud what you and your committee do in connecting the network of experts to people who need to know. One problem for people in my kind of job is that we come in and out of jobs every, civil servants rotate every 2 or 3 years, or 3 or 4 years maybe. So we don't have a sense of history on these sorts of issues, and you certainly do through your 20 years experience in this. So I've got a grand question, I suppose. Are you on the whole discouraged or encouraged with respect to the public's engagement with science over the course of your career?
I think I've seen some encouraging signs. Since Adrian Smith, for example, did his report for Charles Clarke, when Charles Clarke was the Education Secretary, Adrian, who you know professionally, has put in place, or helped put in place, a structure that has massively increased our young people's engagement with mathematics. It's still not high enough, but there was a fall-off in the very first years of this century, and then from about 2005 onwards, you see this, the numbers going right back up again, both in undergraduate applications and in PhD students as well. So there have been some areas that have been very encouraging, some that are very worrying, and I think probably the area that I'd like to see prioritised is actually in primary schools, because I don't know about the people in this audience, but most people get switched on to science at a very, very early age. And things like the National Schools Observatory, which I'm passionate about, not just because Mike Bode, who runs it, is a constituent, that obviously helps, but I actually think it's an incredibly good tool to encourage youngsters to think about astronomy, and a primary school can actually log on to the telescope at La Palma and take real pictures and talk about them in the classroom. It's great fun. Things like that. Field work as well with young people, hugely important. There are some gaps there, very significant gaps, because we don't create the right incentive structure to get people with good science degrees into primary schools. And it's quite clear in my own constituency, those that have good science teachers at primary level actually produce the end results that you would want to see. So what can be done? In Royal Society of Chemistry, for example, in partnership with the Chemical Industries Association, have done a DVD for teachers, for non-science teachers, to help them explain basic scientific concepts to youngsters. I think that kind of thing needs to be focused upon. But generally, there are some encouraging noises as well. I get very frustrated in terms of computer science, because too many people think that computer science is learning how to use programs made by a multinational company rather than actually writing the programs oneself. And you know, if I had to teach myself HTML one summer because nobody else could run my website, I don't use it now. I've like everyone else, I've gone from to a cut and paste one, but needs must. You know, I think it's a great pity that we've drifted away in areas of computer science. We are moving back. There have been some encouraging noises from the Department of Education in the last few weeks. I am deeply disappointed with the story so far on the English back that's been proposed, because there doesn't appear to be a sufficient space there for helping youngsters investigate. I know I shared a platform with Kevin Tebbett, previous Permanent Secretary of the Department of Ministry of Defence recently, who now chairs Fin Mechanica, and he's on the road to Damascus. He's a man who's, I think, studied the greats, and now he's running a major enterprise, realises what a gap there is, and is desperately keen to see things like design and technology included in the curriculum, because those are the areas that young people use to start learning how to investigate things properly, and I think write better English by reporting on them.
So I'm going to interpose some commercial breaks on behalf of the Geological Society as we go through this, if I may. In relation to the primary schools, and I entirely agree with you about the importance of that, we do support Rockwatch directly, which is a wonderful organisation that goes into, reaches the primary school children, gets them into the field, goes to museums. And indeed, a major source of funding for that comes from the people at the Petroleum Group's annual dinner who've been obeying your edicts about alcohol, I should say quickly, who at a late stage in the evening start putting money in the middle of the table for this primary school directed activity.
I think it's fantastic.
Yes, so we're on to that, and we're on to the other school stuff. Yeah. But in fact, there's an event here next month, which I'll tell you about, where we're running a competition with the schools. But we are very aware, are we not, Executive Secretary, President Designate, that we've got a lot more to do in this area, and we need to focus that sharply. Gentleman at the back there.
Andrew Scott, Royal Holloway. One of the issues that you mentioned is this business of very few MPs have a science background. Of course, the other problem is that very few journalists have a science background. A large number of the public have no science background, and so and of course there's then the scientists. To what extent do many of these issues get driven by media, of people who don't understand science, and then MPs react to some of the media stories and they don't understand the science? I mean, how do we get round that problem? Where there are an awful lot of different groups who don't understand science, not just simply MPs.
No, I mean, my example of the shale gas was the absolutely classic one. The regional news media, both printed and television, ran heavily on the Blackpool Tower story. Before anyone could get their oar in and get some good science into the debate. Now, we've had this discussion, my select committee had some private discussions with Professor Steve Jones, who, if you recall, was asked by the BBC Trust to report to them on how science is broadcast. And the problem is very clear, that although, I'll just take the BBC as an example, and the BBC is in the best end of the spectrum. The BBC produced some brilliant, absolutely brilliantly stunning science programmes, and we all love watching them, the Attenboroughs, the Brian Coxes, and things like that, fantastic programmes, and they are great switch-ons. The problem is the news broadcasters, the news editors have this belief that they need to present balance. Well, of course, yes, we do want balance on one political opinion versus another, but just in the same way as in terms of political balance, they don't give the extreme nutters, if I can put it that way, to, as we're being broadcast, equal time with mainstream political theory. They don't do it in politics, so why do they do it in science? And that was the challenge that we discussed in some detail with Steve. And of course, his report to the Trust seeks to encourage that, the news editors to think about their responsibility there, and to ensure that they have a mechanism to be better informed and present the best science when dealing with the story. It is very difficult because the hunger for news is about the bad news stories, and this is a sort of classic example where the idea that quadrilla are going to cause Blackpool Tower to fall down actually seems considerably more newsworthy than out there on the horizon is their drilling rig and you won't see anything of it or hear anything of it. Yeah, that isn't a very newsworthy story, and that's the trouble. It is very difficult, and again, when you have the opportunity, I encourage you all to talk to journalists about real science. Some are very good. I mean, people like Roger Highfield, brilliant at it, and so on, and all power to their elbow, but thin on the ground.
And the trouble is, surely, that though we draw distinctions between things that in your field, Andrew, you would say or tell me were established beyond reasonable doubt, we do that unconsciously. We're not very good at being explicit about that ourselves when we're talking in public. And for those of us involved in debates like the fracking or the climate change, it's very, very difficult in a public setting to keep drawing that boring legal type distinction between the stuff we're all really confident about and the stuff we're not. And it's very, and people like Nigel Lawson are very skilled at drawing one into the kind of, dare I say, political discourse which is not dealing with matters established beyond reason.
I am on, for some reason or other, I'm on the mailing list for their regular emails, and I read them with interest, shall I say.
Good use of that word. I think we've time for maybe one more, a couple more. I see a couple of hands. First, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. My name's Hugh Mallet. How can we, I'm concerned about how we better engage with policymakers, especially ministers. So, for example, where dogmatic policy is pushed through irrespective of any scientific or technical advice. And I'm thinking here as a good example is the new 60-page National Planning Policy Framework, which is going to replace 1,000 pages of guidance, which ministers say is actually a bar to development, irrespective and completely disregarding comments from developers and learned societies and others engaged in the system who use that technical guidance to come to sensible planning policy decisions. And yet we seem unable to get ministers even to listen to arguments in favour of good technical advice, which can then be used to get good decisions.
I think your point extends well beyond planning guidelines, and you know, none of us want to live in, well, at least I don't want to live in a technocracy where everything is decided on its technical merits. Human beings don't quite work like that, and we do end up with some pretty daft decisions as a result. But the planning example you give is, I think, one that is enormously complicated. That we have huge pressures on us on the one hand to deal with the planning process more speedily, but at the same time better engagement with citizens. And I think the missing link is often the engagement with citizens. I'm represented actually by my wife, as it happens. She's sitting in the audience on a group of people who are representing the community, dealing with a big industrial development on Ince Marshes, for those of you who know the geography, alongside the Stanlow oil refinery. Now, the Stanlow oil refinery is an oil refinery with all the downsides of living near an oil refinery. But people are up in arms about a waste management operation that's being developed alongside it. And the company had the good sense to create a community liaison group to take people through all the technical planning issues very, very carefully and systematically, and it's working. So I think speed is needed, but actually speed can be achieved by adopting a different management process than simply saying we're going to cut down the number of pages and drive things through quickly. And I very much take your point about the technical inputs that comes from a wide range of disciplines as a result of those several thousand pages of guidance. It's a tough one, that.
We can take a couple more if everybody promises to be really punchy in both question and answer.
Sorry.
Are we on? Are we on?
All right.
Yeah, first, Mike Daly. Yes.
Mike Daly from BP. The UK has a wealth of national scientific capability, and you're here tapping into a part of it. But there are the universities, the British Geological Survey, the multinational oil companies. I wonder how you actually decide who to listen to, because those voices are often quite varied, even like we were saying about the newspaper. So how does Parliament, how do you wait and understand these different voices and, you know, decide what you put into policy making?
I think there is an acceptance that it's a good idea for things to be evidence-based, but there are exceptions, and there are exceptions that are very significant. In the health service, for example, one sees facilities that are developed that aren't necessarily based upon the wisdom of scientific evidence in its entirety. The difficulty, though, is that you're right, we get bombarded with information from such a wide range of sources, and if there's something controversial coming up, I'm just to take you back to that example of the waste plant that's being developed in my patch, which is quite a sophisticated thing, dealing with some of the issues that you have been discussing as a society about scarce minerals and recovery and so on and so forth. It's a very sophisticated operation, but of course at the end of the waste stream there are bits of it that's hard to do anything with other than create energy from it. And the company rather foolishly called it an incinerator instead of a generator. I had 500 letters from people objecting to that plant for some reason or another. Now, the easy thing to do would be to say that's 500 to none, therefore those people are right. And after all, that's my livelihood, isn't it? Affected. I was elected originally with a majority that was less than 2,000, so 500 votes is a lot. But you know, occasionally you have to be honest with people and say, no, look, there were issues about the development, there were issues about access and transport and overloading the village if roads weren't used properly and so on and so forth. There were lots of reasons why there needed to be controls coming out of those thousands of pages of planning guidance, but the reason for the incinerator itself was not a reason for saying no, because the science does not say that a modern incinerator working at high temperature is going to do your health any damage. And given your background, you will know that next door to it, the technology at Stanlow is relatively old. So if anything's going to do damage to your health, it's likely to be your neighbour. Now, we're working with Shell, of course, not Shell now, it's SR, to raise those standards to a very high level. But the public aren't looking at that, they're looking at the new developments. So it's very, very hard picking, but you have to persuade MPs that they've got to be honest with people about some of these issues. And on that one, I avoided the temptation of going with the crowd, and I'm still here.
Okay, now this one really is going to be a one-liner both ways. The gentleman there.
Andrew, surely if one can go beyond science, one of the problems that you as MPs and anyone in science has in getting across to the general public is the appalling lack of, I won't even call it numeracy, but basic arithmetic from most people who can't even understand percentages, let alone a geometric curve. And it goes back to a basic lack of education in its real sense. Simple arithmetic.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I despair at the number of youngsters who reach for a calculator, and not some young people these days as well, who mental arithmetic has gone. I was surprised. My daughter is a very high-level mathematician, and when she's in her early 30s now, when she did her GCSE, she had never seen a log table. In fact, she was doing a piece of work on a very early PC that we had at home, and she said, "Dad, come and have a look at this." And she showed me some work she'd been doing, a piece of trigonometry, and she said, "Do you know you could write a set of tables around that?" And she's going to be a mathematician. I reached behind and said, "Like this, Napier beat you to it." Yeah, yes, there are different ways of teaching mathematics, but I do wish we could get back, and this is why I said in response to the very first question, how important I think primary schools are. We need to do more to get teachers. There are lots and lots of very, very inspiring primary school teachers up and down the country. There's some fantastic people, but they could be even better the more help we can give them for better continued development throughout their careers, so they engage with new things that are happening in the scientific disciplines, so that they can be up to speed, so that when they walk across inch marshes near us, we're going pond dipping with the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, a great fun, but nobody ever talks to them about those electricity pylons and what they're there for, or what the backdrop of the oil refinery is doing and what it does in terms of the economic wealth of the nation. And I think that's where we need to focus, really. And I'd say, I'm saying that very clearly without denigrating a wonderful bunch of people who are teaching in our schools. They need help, and they love getting it, but there's not the time in the curriculum, we need the space to do it, and we need to think about how we undertake teacher training as well. But that's where I'd start. Thank you, Andrew.
If you'd like to just step aside for a moment, and I'll say some nice things about you. Time for another short commercial break on behalf of the Geological Society. I think Andrew Scott raised the question of the quality of the public debate. And I think we have in our very set of rules that govern our behaviour as a society, a good clause, which I paraphrase, says roughly, if you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And by and large, with coaching from our good friends, such as Andrew, we've tried to get there with that particular rule. And it's when you start trying to do it, in reality, it's very much more difficult than you think, because you have to then draw the question raised by Mike Daly's comment, which is, how do we pick out from amongst our diverse fellowship? And it really is a very diverse fellowship with diverse interests, diverse intellectual backgrounds and beliefs. How do we pick out something that we can fairly go on your behalf to Whitehall and Westminster and say, here's our advice on shale gas, here's our advice on the geological evidence on climate change, on rare earth distribution on the planet, carbon capture and storage, the list is there. Tsunamis coming up the Severn Estuary, which is one I think is missing off your list there. And the answer to that is, it's tough, but what we have done in the last couple of years is got together with the university geology departments in a formal fashion and with the British Geological Survey, and comments on the sort of matters that I've just described to you don't go out from Burlington House over one signature, my signature. They go out over 3 signatures. Mine, the director of the British Geological Survey, and the chair of the heads of the University Geology departments at that committee. And Edmund and I were in a meeting earlier today with the representative of the academic group. Last week I was at meetings with the British Geological Survey people. This is one way, Mike, we're trying to tackle the question you raise. But let us be inspired by your talk, Andrew, for which we thank you very much indeed, to realize that what we're trying to do is worthwhile, and importantly and crucially, and this is what I got from this evening's talk, your wonderful talk and the discussion, is that it's worthwhile. If you get it right, you do make a difference. We're in your debt for this evening and for many, many years of help you've given to our community, and we look forward to a long continuation of that association. Thank you very much indeed.